Okie doke. Hey, everybody. I'm Christy, and this is Tom, and there's Joy and Mel, and we're with Our Revolution of Lane County. So today we're going to have the yes on 101 and no on 101 debate. There'll be, two. Thank you. Anyway, we're going to have that happen at 11:30.
All right, testing. How's this? Okay, perfect. I'm Emily Reiman. I'm the Executive Director of NEDCO, the Neighborhood Economic Development Corporation. We're a nonprofit here in town, started back in 1979, and our mission is to help low and moderate income families and neighborhoods build financial stability and build assets. That's a very large, ambitious sort of a goal, and affordable housing is just one piece of what we do, but that's what's brought me here today. We've been an affordable housing developer for many years. We develop both rental housing and housing for ownership by first-time homebuyers. So we occupy both spaces in the affordable housing industry. And NEDCO has formally endorsed Measure 102, so I'm here today to speak on behalf of that measure and urge support of it. So I want to start by giving a little bit of background about affordable housing development and how it works. I think that's going to be a good framework to be able to talk specifically about the measure that we're trying to pass this November. Affordable housing is a very complex industry that has evolved over the last 40, 50, 60 years. But what it looks like today is that most affordable housing development is done by nonprofit organizations. So in Oregon, 85% of affordable housing units are built by nonprofit developers. In Lane County, that's actually even higher. It's probably closer to 95%. And the local nonprofit developers here, you probably have heard of all of them. It's St. Vincent de Paul, it's NEDCO, it's Cornerstone, it's Homes for Good, it's Shelter Care. So those organizations are building the vast majority of affordable housing. To put an affordable housing deal together is incredibly complicated because what we're trying to do is build a structure, build units of housing that can house people for artificially low rents for a very long time. So normal housing is built, a developer goes out, they get a loan, they build the property, they might have a little bit of their own equity in the building, and the rents that they charge over time pay off the loan for them. So they can service their debt with the rents that are coming in. They also can count on those rents going up over time with inflation and with the housing market, so that over time when a roof needs to be replaced or a heating system needs to be repaired, they can count on their rents having gone up and being able to cover those repairs in addition to the debt that they're paying off, right? So that's sort of market rate housing and how it's developed. In affordable housing, we're developing housing that we know we're going to rent at below market rates. And that is generally set by the type of subsidy that we're getting into the housing. So we can't just go out and get a loan to build this because we know we're not going to make enough in rents to pay that off. So we have to go out and get public subsidy. And we can get public subsidy from public sources at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. We can get subsidy from private foundations or private donors, but we're usually putting together 4 or 6 or 8 or sometimes 12 different funding sources to try to pull into a project to be able to build whatever it is we're trying to build. And there's a back and forth set of communication about what money we're asking for and what we commit to doing with it. So we might know that we want to serve people at 50% of median income and below, or maybe it's 30% of median income and below, or maybe it's people with no income at all. And that tells us what rents we're going to be able to charge over time. So we know what that figure is, and we go out and seek money that is allowed for that source. So different pools of subsidy might say, we want our subsidy to go to below 50%, or we want our subsidy to go to below 30%, or we want our subsidy to go to immediate transition out of homelessness. And so it becomes this jigsaw puzzle of how do you put together the right subsidy for the population that you want to serve so that you have enough money to build the building, and then you know that you can keep your rents low enough that it becomes affordable to whatever the population is that you're trying to serve. And that becomes a very difficult jigsaw puzzle because every funder that you're approaching has a different set of requirements that they want to impose on that building. And you have to make sure that whatever project you're doing and the population you're serving, you can meet all of those layered requirements. It's not just the requirements of one funder, it's the requirements of all of them. And this is why affordable housing has become very difficult to develop, because this is the sort of puzzle picture that we've put together. One of the biggest sources of funding that plays a role in that is from the federal government, and they're called low-income housing tax credits, LIHTC sometimes you'll hear. And this is by far the biggest source of funding. I don't know percentage-wise, but probably more than half of affordable funding comes from this one source. And it's not a direct grant to an agency that's building housing. We get an allocation of tax credits, and then we have to go find a partner who wants to buy tax credits because they owe a tax liability, right? We as nonprofits don't owe taxes. So we go find an investor who wants to buy those tax credits from us, and that's how we get the money to actually build the housing. Because of that complicated transaction, because we have investors and they have requirements under which they operate, we're actually creating independent LLCs or independent legal entities to own that building while the investor is part of the project. So it's owned by a company that might be controlled by NEDCO, but it's not actually NEDCO. So you can imagine the complexity of this landscape, right? In the middle of this, we have a constitutional provision in Oregon that says that local governments cannot lend their credit on behalf of private entities. This dates back to the 1850s, I believe, and it was originally put into the Constitution because of fears about the railroad barons and local governments basically doing favors on behalf of the railroad barons and funneling money to them. And so we have this provision that if a city is going to use their credit, so issue a bond, for example, they have to build, own, manage whatever that bond is building themselves. They can't partner with a private entity, either nonprofit or for-profit. They can't partner with anybody. So if a city or a county now were to issue an affordable housing bond, they would have to become the housing developer, the housing owner, and the housing operator, which means they would suddenly be in the business of entering this incredibly complex, crazy universe, and they would have to be landlords to people who lived in their housing. Cities don't want to do this. Most of the affordable development world doesn't want cities to do this because we're afraid that they would do it in ways that are somewhat less than efficient. And the other thing is they can't partner. So even if the city wanted to own it, but they wanted to partner with a nonprofit developer and bring in tax credits to this project, they can't do it because they can't be part of a separate legal entity that's created on behalf of this property. So they can't even be a partial owner. They have to be a 100% owner. Which means effectively any housing that was built with that type of bond would have to be built 100% financed by that bond. You couldn't bring in state dollars, you couldn't bring in federal dollars, you couldn't have the sort of layer that leverages other resources to allow us to build more units. You would only be able to build as many units as could be 100% financed by that bond, which also is terribly inefficient. So, for example, Portland Metro, the Tri-County area, is considering a bond this fall parallel to this constitutional amendment. If the bond passes and the amendment doesn't, they expect to be able to build somewhere between 7,000 and 7,500 units of housing. If the bond passes and the constitutional amendment passes, they expect to be able to build 12,000 units of housing. So we're not talking a few more units, we're talking a lot more units if they're able to pull in other subsidy sources. So that's why NEDCO, it's why other affordable housing developers were the ones who approached the legislature to say, we need to change this provision. We don't need to do it broadly because we understand the concern about public dollars going to private entities, right? So we don't want to open this up to every industry. We just recognize that affordable housing could be accomplished so much better and at such higher volume and scale and so much more efficiently if we could tweak it for affordable housing. So it's really important to understand that Measure 102 changes it only for the development of affordable housing and the issuing of bonds for affordable housing. It doesn't change anything else related to parks or railroads or other public buildings. It's only affordable housing. It also requires that when a local municipality issues a bond or puts a bond on the ballot, that they have to define what affordable housing means. So a local municipality would have to say, we believe that all of this money should fund units affordable below 30% AMI. Or maybe they might say 50% of the money should go to below 30% AMI and 50% should go up to 50% AMI. They get to define that. The Portland Metro one is tiered like that. So the majority of money goes to very low income people and a little bit of the money goes to moderately low income people. And we as the voters get to decide whether we agree with that definition of affordable housing or not. So we're the ones who get to make that ultimate call. I get a lot of questions about why that's not specified, why affordable housing isn't defined in the amendment itself, right? The reason for that is that in every local place, I keep referring to median income, right? 50% of median income, 80% of median income. Median income varies by county. And that's federally defined. Median income varies by county. So median income in rural counties, like a Douglas County or like an Eastern Oregon county, are very, very low compared to median incomes in urban areas. So if we, as the state, set a level that made sense for urban areas, it's not going to make sense for rural areas. And if we set one that made sense for rural areas, it's not going to make sense for urban areas. So the decision was very practically made. We need to let local municipalities define this for themselves and then give voters ultimate control for whether they believe that's the right definition or not for their local community. I see a hand. Am I allowed to take questions?
No, we're gonna do a combined Q&A at noon to 12:30. Since we're on a tight schedule, we want to contain it. Thanks.
Thank you. A couple other quick points I want to make just based on common questions that I get. The Register Guard editorial here a couple weeks back that didn't endorse this measure cited as one of their reasons that while the constitutional amendment requires an annual audit by any municipality that's passed a bond, it doesn't specify an independent audit. And here's why I actually disagree with that as a reason to be opposed to this bill. Affordable housing is one of the most highly regulated industries out there. So I referred to the 4 or 6 or 12 or 18 funding sources that we get in. All of those funding sources also have annual audits, and we have to report back on all of the parameters that they've set for their funding. So one of the parameters that gets set, and one of the parameters that would be part of this bond, is the length of affordability. So with tax credits, the national tax credits I talked about, typically those come with a 60-year affordability. So if you're committing to a given rent level or a given affordability, you have to maintain that for 60 years. And the state housing authority comes in and checks on us and audits us regularly, and we have to report annually to make sure that we are meeting those affordability requirements, that we're maintaining the property well, that we're providing the services to the residents that we committed to on the front end. And every single source of funding that we have has that same right. So we report sometimes until I cry because it takes so much time and effort to satisfy the reporting requirements. And we have so many people in our business that we sometimes have 2 or 3 entities auditing us at any one time. Adding additional requirements to that is only going to slow down our ability to develop housing, and it's only going to waste our effort at trying to actually build or provide services or do work that impacts people's lives. I'm entirely comfortable with the provision as it's written now, which is that the municipality should have to report back to the voters about what's been accomplished with that money. But it shouldn't be an extra time-intensive, extra costly kind of an audit. It should be whatever is specified. And if any of you are familiar with affordable housing as it's developed now, Sponsors and Homes for Good just launched a great one on Oak Patch if you want to drive by it. St. Vinny's just launched a great one on Main Street in Springfield. You can drive by these buildings and see the quality of them. All of the buildings that are building right now in our community are built with exactly this public-private partnership. It's dollars coming from the state and from the city, but they're built by private nonprofit developers. So the housing that we're building now and that everybody supports in this community is exactly the type of housing we would be building more of with this bond. It doesn't change the development practices, it doesn't change how things are financed, it just allows us to build upon a system that is actually functioning pretty well today. We just don't have nearly enough dollars. We can't possibly get enough units up because the streams of public subsidy are so low, and this one, which would be sizable, the ability of local governments to issue bonds, is just not open to us because it doesn't make sense. Portland is the only one who's even been willing to try, and they're struggling hugely, and none of the smaller cities and counties are interested in even delving into that game because there are just so many barriers. They don't want to touch it. So effectively right now, bonds are just off the table as a tool for affordable housing. And we're in the middle of a housing crisis. We need every possible tool we can get, and we need the ability to use those tools as efficiently as possible. So that's why NEDCO's endorsed 102. I'm voting yes on 102. I would encourage all of you to vote yes on 102. It's a very wonky subject, and I know we'll have time for questions, so I hope I'll have time to go into a little bit more detail. And
here's Zondie Zinke.
Hi.
I can just orient you a little bit more to who I am. I'm a writer and therefore also a researcher and a mother. I've also worked in homeless shelters and in direct service with the marginally housed population for 10 years. And also my mother was homeless for 3 years, and those years remain painful to recall. I want to say that something we all agree on is that we have to do something. Anyone who doesn't want to sleep on the street should be able to access housing. People who are housed should be stably housed and not worried about an ability to make ends meet. Housing is not a right by birth. Nature, if we're born into nature, we got to fend for ourselves. But in a government, a human-organized, government-controlled society where police can come and say, you can't sleep there, you can't pee there, then housing becomes a human right that needs to be provided for by the government. Otherwise, what is the purpose of government? So I think, thank you. So I think Emily would agree as well. What we don't agree on here is how to make that happen. Emily is saying that this tool, what advocates call being able to create public-private partnerships, is an important part of the overall effort to create affordable housing. I believe, and my research leads me to believe, quite the opposite. Paving the way for local jurisdictions to fund private ventures in affordable housing is not only a strategy that will likely lead to the greater impoverishment of our communities, it is also one that will interfere with what may be one of the best of options for affordably housing everyone, and that is to increase our publicly owned housing stock. Okay? So let me first say that municipal bond money to fund affordable housing is not off the table without Measure 102. In fact, if Measure 102 doesn't pass, Portland will have its bond. And the metro area, if that passes, will have its bond. And when Emily says, you know, without passing Measure 102, the bond measures up in Portland or the metro area can fund 7,000 to 7,500 units and maybe 1,200 or 1,300 units if the measure passes. Okay, that is conflating two different sections of funding, right? The funding that could, you know, let's say that extra 5,000 units that could be funded if Measure 102 passes, those can be funded anyway through the mechanisms that already exist and are already building affordable housing. NEDCO partners with these tax credit investors, right, and builds those affordable units. That would still happen. So it's not like Emily's great work disappears if Measure 102 doesn't pass, right? Those units those funders would work, you know, the private investors working with the nonprofit sector, they are still going to build units, right? So that statistic is just screwed. I hope we can see that, right? She doesn't agree, but we can talk about it. Okay, so the other thing is NEDCO, Emily was saying, and we've heard that the funding stream for this LIHTC, that's the Low Income Housing Tax Exemption Credit, is decreasing. First of all, it's not true. It's an $8 billion a year industry, and in fact, in 2018 to 2001, it's just been increased by 12%. So that revenue stream will be going up, okay? I want, probably one big job I have here is to debunk this idea that combining our money, the public-private sector partnerships, are, so that works through this tax credit. It was a Reagan-era tax credit passed in 1986 to which funneled public funds for affordable housing into the private sector. You have to be in the private sector to receive these federal government funds, right? I have, so that was passed in 1986 under Reagan. In 1992, still under Reagan, because it was in April, the Office of the Congressional Budget issued a report on the effectiveness of the low-income tax exemption credit. Here's the report. So this is a report within the administration that issued this, right? The low-income housing credit, like other supply subsidy mechanisms, is unlikely to increase substantially the supply of affordable housing. Subsidized housing largely replaces other housing that would have been available through the private, unsubsidized housing market. In other words, the developers who do make a lot of money on this, then particularly the investors, would be making that housing anyway, but now guess what? Corporate interests, they're getting corporate welfare, they're getting the tax subsidy, right? We see this all over the place, same thing. It goes on, the improvement in quality is generally worth, so it says, moreover, while the new subsidized housing is almost certainly better than the housing it replaces, the improvement in quality is generally worth much less to tenants than its cost to the government. Okay? It costs the government in a 10-year period between 2008 and 2017, $67 billion. That was the cost to the government. Okay, so that was in 1992. In 2010, under the Obama administration, the evaluation is this. The President's Economic Recovery Advisory Board estimated that LIHTC, that's this tax credit, the privatization that we're talking about joining a partnership with, the LIHTC program would cost the government $61 billion in lost tax revenue from participating corporations, as well as noting that experts believe vouchers, money given essentially directly to much more directly to subsidize and more efficiently to subsidize low-income households, would be more cost-effective in helping low-income households. There are, in 2017, Frontline did an expose, a quite moving but extremely disturbing expose about the inefficiencies of the LIHTC program. Again, that's the privatization, the public-private partnership program. Its inefficiencies as well as its corruptions. So I have that report, and I'm happy. Sorry, that's a Frontline report, 2017. You just look up low-income housing tax exemption and Google that, and you'll see it. It's an hour and very well worth watching. Where do I have it? All over, you have to be researching this yourself, but you'll see there are all over huge scandals because this is such a huge industry, an $8 billion a year industry. When Emily says there are so many eyes on this, right, that there's just, there's so much oversight. Well, one of it was in Florida, the prosecuting attorney said, it is ridiculous to think that there is strong oversight. We have state housing agencies with not a lot of manpower, not very big budgets, up against people with major resources, major corporate interests, and they just can't, the IRS leaves it to them, and they can't perform the oversight. So this has been exposed again and again over the 30 years. In terms of, okay, let me watch my time. 6 more minutes. Okay, so let me move on. Well, since this is our Revolution Lane County, let me just say that Bernie's recommendations, okay, he has listed 8 categories of recommendations, right, for how to address the the affordable housing crisis. And do any one of them mention public-private partnerships? No, no, nowhere in Bernie's language is an endorsement of public-private partnership, right? What does Bernie recommend? The National Affording House Trust Fund, which he proposed in 2001, finally got passed in 2008, and just began releasing funds in 2016. Thank you, Bernie. And you know who, unlike the LIHTC program, which does not actually, most of the funds do not go to extremely low income households, in other words, the people most direly in need, Bernie's program does, okay? Of course, Bernie's program doesn't have the funding yet to the extent of the corporate welfare tax credit funding, but he's working, he's pushing, and we'll get behind him and grow that to the $5 billion per year that he's looking for. His second recommendation, right, is to raise the minimum wage, right? That is empowering to the people and not the corporations. He has, obviously, strengthening anti-discrimination laws, demanding more from the affordable housing developers, right? So in Vermont, he says we require affordable housing to remain affordable permanently. He doesn't strike a deal unless it's permanent, okay? The LIHTC public-private partnership that we're talking about, it's a 30-year, right? A 30-year commitment. It was 15, it got bumped up, although you can't, although after in the second 15-year extension, you can't actually recapture the tax credit, so I don't even know how that compliance is enforced. He says we have to repair public housing, protect rental assistance, and expand the housing choice initiative, increase funding for vouchers, which again is far more empowering to the individual and not to the corporations. And both the Obama administration and the Reagan administration, both of their studies show that the voucher program is more effective than this public-private partnership. Okay, we also, Bernie is not our only resource. We have, in the aftermath of Bernie's great campaign, we have the People's Policy Project, which is a hugely growing think tank, and they have issued a report on how to address the affordable housing crisis in America. And what's their #1 recommendation? Municipally owned public affordable housing, okay? Municipally owned. So if we change our Constitution and pave the way for corporate interests so that our bond monies are no longer municipally owned, our bond money no longer goes to publicly owned affordable housing, then we have just lost one of the #1 recommendations, right? Democratic Socialists in Austin, 900 members strong, are pushing for a 20% of the Austin housing stock to be publicly owned, right? In Vienna, something else you might appreciate as burners, those of you who are burners, the People's Policy Project looks, of course, to Sweden, to Finland. Vienna, in Austria's biggest city, 80% of the housing in Vienna is municipally run, publicly owned. Thank you. Okay, I hope during question, I only have 1 minute left. There's lots of other great ideas, including we have people right now organizing for first decile housing, and it would be so much more cost effective than any public-private partnerships, not to mention all the reports, which I failed to read. The beneficiaries of the public-private partnerships are the financiers, the developers, the brokers, the syndicators, and even nonprofit administrators. I don't think Emily Reiman's at this level of like, you know, big funds, but they're in there as top beneficiaries of this public-private partnership. I hope during questions you will ask about the particular language of the amendment that's put forth, because I think if we can look at it in detail, and I'm happy to do this afterwards individually as well, we can see that whether the nonprofits are championing it or not, it clearly represents corporate interests, and it is written with maximal leeway for them to profiteer. Thank you.
So first of all, I'd like to thank both of you for coming. And I'd like to say we respect the work that St. Vinny's and organizations like NEDCO do. I think my question is, well, first you said something, you both talked about public housing. You have two very different views on public housing. I believe that the only way we're going to solve this problem is to get our local governments back into public housing. If we rely on the corporations to do it, and I'm not putting NEDCO or St. Vinny's in that group. If we rely on corporations out of the kindness of their heart to give us affordable housing, and they determine what affordable housing is, we've got a problem. So I'd like a little bit of clarification. I grew up in low-income housing that was bought, paid, and built for in Anchorage, Alaska, and you know, it was a huge help. I'd like a little clarification on why you think that housing that is owned by the people, basically regulated by the people and such, and we have control over it, would be a bad idea. And I guess that's my question. I'm out of time, so.
Sure. Thanks for the question. So I want to clarify one thing in that there are two ways that for-profit companies can be involved in a low-income housing tax credit deal, right? There can be for-profit developers that build and own and operate affordable housing. This doesn't happen much in Oregon. It happens more in other states. And so, yes, some other states have had problems with this. I would point out that most of those developers are not getting rich from the affordable housing. They're getting rich from fraud, which is a different thing. But in Oregon, the way our state finance agency has structured how they run this system, it is prohibitively complicated, and for-profit developers don't want to do it. That's why 85% of housing in Oregon is built by nonprofit entities like NEDCO, like St. Vinny's. And as I said, even higher than that here in Lane County. So the vast majority of the people building, owning, operating housing, affordable housing in Oregon are nonprofits. And I'm happy to share my financials with anybody who's interested in seeing how little money we make on these deals. I'm sure that the other nonprofits in the area would be willing to do that too. The industry in Oregon is different, and this measure is in Oregon. What we're talking about here is Oregon. It's not the rest of the nation. The other thing I want to clarify is that you know, you just heard a pretty impassioned plea against the inefficiency of the tax credit system, and frankly, I couldn't agree more. I don't like the tax credit system. I wish that the federal government would give money like they do through the Low-Income Housing Fund directly to nonprofit developers, directly to states to build housing. The tax credit thing is a game, and it's a terrible game. It's what got passed by Congress, largely because that's what the Republicans would support. So it's what we have to work with. I wish it was otherwise, but it's what we have to work with. And the money that corporations make off of buying tax credits, I agree, it's ridiculous. They shouldn't. And if anybody here wants to start a campaign against that system, I will be the first to sign up to door knock with you. But the bond that we're talking about here, the local municipal bonds, would actually be administered very much much like that National Housing Trust Fund money. The National Housing Trust Fund that Bernie supports goes to each state, to their Housing Finance Authority, and it gets wrapped into these public-private deals, exactly as the local bond money would from the city of Eugene or Lane County. That's a way more efficient way to fund affordable housing development, and it cuts out the vast majority of where corporations touch a project. That money then in Oregon is going to come 85, 90, 95% to nonprofit developers, which is exactly how it should function.
Thanks. If I can touch on that question too. When we talk about efficiency and we talk about like there's no other alternatives, this report, which I think everyone should take a look at from the People's Policy Project, they, first of all, Sweden, with a population of 8 million, through entirely public funded housing, built 1 million units in 10 years, and that's for a population of 8 million. We build, it's actually going down the number of units, something like, it was 73,000 units, now it's down to 60,000 units, despite a 66% increase in funding for this, and where increased construction costs only account for about 50% of that. So more money spent, decline in what is, how many units produced. That doesn't sound like efficiency, but the other thing is Emily doesn't like it, I don't like it. Why would we want to take the resource that we have and give it towards this system? Here's a little bit of advocacy for public funded affordable housing. A local administration which can build its own housing can never be held hostage by developers expecting an unreasonable profit margin again. Now, of course, we've had public funding, we've had publicly owned housing in the past. The big push was in the 30s, and that was during segregation, right? We had social ills that majorly affected that public housing. We can learn how to do it better, right? And one study, one of the recommendations they make is actually a model by which you can have solidarity rents, you have mixed income, publicly owned public housing, and there are rents that would bring in profit to the cities, and those rents would be in solidarity with ones that were subsidized, so that in the long run, cities can actually, rather than these public assets being a drain for the city, they can actually help their revenue. So there's, we can learn from what went wrong and do it better. But if we don't understand that the people need to have non-market interference in our basic human right. Thank you.
Thank you both for coming up and speaking with us. It's obviously a lot of interest in this issue. We're a group largely of activists, and we kind of have ideals that we're shooting for, and we try to push those actions in all that we can. Zondie, you've got wonderful ideas. We've talked quite a bit on Facebook about your ideas on better ways to do this than Measure 102. Bernie's ideas, a lot of those are idealistic, better ways that we would like to approach this. What we need to caution is what I call inaction in the form of advocacy. There are people right now who need affordable housing who are on the verge of homelessness. Not to mention the homelessness already. We don't have those other options on the table. Those are not on our November ballot. So we have to be realistic when we think, what can we do right now? This is something that has come from the legislature. It was put forth there from their nonprofits. It's a way that we can, I'll get to it, I have a minute. It's a way to, well, okay. Anyway, it's a way for us to address something that we have right now. So we need to realize that we need to champion those other ideas, but we don't have them in front of us right now. And when we do champion those, they can replace what we've passed in prior times. My question is, Emily, how do you expect to gain from Measure 102? Do you expect a big raise?
Thanks for the question. So I mentioned earlier that there's a lot of oversight of affordable housing development. One of the things we have to turn in with any funding application is a complete pro forma for the project. So line item by line item, down to the penny, how much everything is going to cost, how much the architect's going to get paid, how much the construction materials are going to cost. One of the line items is how much we as a nonprofit developer get as the developer fee, which is basically the money that covers our staff and overhead and all of that. That is set by limit by the funders. So we know when we apply, it can't be more than, say, 6% or some X percent of the project. We're usually asking for less because the project just doesn't pencil if we get the full 6% as a developer fee. So oftentimes we're deflating what our organization gets paid, and we're trying to subsidize this work from other sources because the project doesn't pencil and we can't make it affordable enough if we even take the minimum, the maximum. So none of that changes whether you're nonprofit or for-profit. So if a for-profit were applying for the funding, they would face the same limits, and none of that changes with the additional bond money. This isn't like extra money flooding into projects that's changing the financial structure of any project. It's just allowing us to do more. So what NEDCO might gain from this is if Eugene, if Springfield, if Lane County ever passed a local bond, which would be a different campaign and a different discussion about whether we should do that, we might get to build more housing.
I just want to say, James, that this isn't on, for our community, this isn't on the table now either, right? If this passes and our Constitution changes, we still have to come forward with something. And if we don't have corporate interests on the table, then we'll be able to come forward with something much better. I agree that it is up to the people because the government is, we have to push them so that our interests are represented, and we need to get something on the table for the next ballot, and that could be a bond measure, right, to fund publicly owned affordable housing, and that's as quickly as anything else could happen.
My question, affordable housing, the term is confusing to many people, myself, about what exactly you're talking about. So when I needed to research this bond measure or the constitutional amendment, talking to a person in Portland who actually put it together, a friend, my first question was, what kind of housing are you talking about? Is it rental or owned housing? Because there's a lot of discussion about affordable, Habitat for Humanity or the supply of housing make housing unaffordable. But affordable housing, in the view of the people who develop it in Portland, is rental housing. And no, they're not interested in supporting owned housing, is the impression I got. That's a wealth-generating mechanism, said the backer of the bonds for affordable housing up there. Now, in Portland, they've got enough support to pass the bonds, even to build public housing, and this would expand it greatly, the usefulness of public money. But in an area like here, where we have not supported it, I want to know what protection there is against money raised through bonds for affordable housing being used in partnerships that support this kind of wealth-generating thing, the home ownership that drives up cost of housing overall by attracting everybody with their equity to put it into the number one way for families to save money, buy as much house as you can. What protection is there here against our public money being used into that scheme?
Good question, and you and I should talk homeownership sometime because homeownership is actually core to NEDCO's mission. The protection is the voters. So the local municipality that's considering a bond has to define how the money would be used and has to define affordable housing. So Eugene or Lane County would have to specify in the bond whether 100% was going to rental or whether any was going to ownership and at what income level both of those would happen. And then the voters get to decide whether they agree with that or not. I actually think there are ways to do affordable ownership that is sort of splits the private good with the public good, and it oftentimes looks like land trust housing or co-op housing that has long-term affordability restrictions on it so that it doesn't become a big equity gain for any one family. It becomes a way for them to gain a little bit of equity and asset, and also when they sell it, it's to another low-income family and it becomes a permanently affordable unit for Eugene. So if a local municipality wanted to consider homeownership and wanted to help some families make that move out of poverty, I think there are ways to do it that actually protects the public good.
I think that I have to question when Emily says that these bond measures would have to specify this and have to specify that and have to specify that. There is nothing in the way the amendment is written, and this is what makes me know that it has corporate interests written into it. Nothing, it simply says the measure authorizing the bonded indebtedness, one requirement is that it describes affordable housing for the purposes of the measure. It could say, describes, it could provide, it could say it needs to provide very specific metrics about, percentage of the median income. It could say it needs to specify the affordability period. It could say it needs to specify, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It doesn't. It is as vague as could possibly be. It simply needs to describe, right?
And if it comes to us vague, then we should vote it down. But I will assure you that the nonprofits who want this to pass, if there is a bond proposed, will be part of crafting that. And all of us should be part of crafting that to have passed what we think is important for affordable housing in our community.
So, Rick Gold from KPW. Thank you. 97.3 FM. So how likely is this measure? Right now, there's a certain landscape of nonprofits or whatnot doing this thing. How likely is it after this passes for there to be more corporate involvement in this landscape? And the other question is, I don't see anything in reading this measure about the money aspect of this. When you develop this type of bond, is it ongoing? Are people always going to be having to pay money into this? How, what happens with the money,
So let me just say something on Emily's comment that she just made about how there will be input. I'm sure there'll be nonprofit input. Two things. One, right now the city is, they have the housing working group where they supposedly have a cross-section of volunteer members. They're hand-selected volunteer members serving on a committee. I think there's about 35 of them. Okay, it is stacked. It's not that there are no, there are neighborhood representatives, Emily from NEDCO, but it is stacked with developer and real estate, et cetera, people. And they know the numbers they need for a citizen-backed recommendation. Beyond that, at the larger level, if you look at literature on developing a successful public-private partnership, you know what it says? It says you need to anticipate flare-ups from the populace. You need to prevent certain public awarenesses and even protests. And the way to do this, one of the ways, is to very carefully manage the public communications, how this is all packaged. And before you come public, make sure you have gained as many endorsements as possible, so that is a major way to suppress. I know 5 years ago, had I looked at this measure and seen the endorsements it had, I would be voting for it. Brain off.
So I just want to reiterate that there's nothing about this new money, if we're able to bring it into the system, that would change the pro forma, that would change the financial model for how this housing is developed. The model exists, and this would be a new source of money to bring to it. But the amount of money that a developer could make, the complexity of it, the oversight of it, none of that's going to change. So in Oregon, that is a system that private developers don't want to participate in because they can't make money at it. They can make money going and building private housing. And the local bond, again, it's not going to change the model. It's going to bring more money in for more projects to happen, but the projects are going to look very much the same that they do now. So there aren't private developers lining up to try to pass this. This is entirely motivated by the nonprofit developers who want to be able to be more responsive and want to get more units on the ground.
Can we have another question?
Yeah. One thing I just want to say, I think this is a pretty classic situation. We're going to keep facing things like this. There's an opportunity to get something positive accomplished maybe, but by continuing to do things as they've been done, by continuing to kind of move in the pocket of corporations a bit. But we don't, as James said, we don't have anything else on the table. So I feel like if we reject this, we better be willing to get our shit together and put something else forward. But the question I have is this. When you spoke, you said that in Portland, the current bond, if it passes, they'll be able to build extra housing if this bond passes. And then you said, no, that's not the case. That'll happen anyway. And I just want to give you a chance. I'd just like to hear from both of you to get on the same page what the reality is, or what we can get clear either where you agree on it and where you disagree on it, and where we can go to find out more ourselves. Because it sounds like there's not even agreement on whether opening this up will produce more housing.
Okay, so I can refer you to the Frontline. It's sort of easier to refer you to that because you can just Google it and watch it. It's kind of enjoyable, though painful to watch. The where they say, someone's going around with a microphone. Why do you invest in this? Why do you do this? Because it's a robust. The affordable housing market is robust, and it is profitable. It has good. It has strong after-tax profit yields, and so I mean, we're just. I guess you will have to go and fact check us both. I will tell you. You know who's getting in the industry now? It's been the big banks. They've been in there, but now Google's joining, Facebook joining, LinkedIn is joining, United Health is joining. More and more of the big industries are getting in this because there are profit margins. Okay, they're not doing it. Because there aren't profit margins, right? They're not doing it out of their own good hearts, right? And so at the very least, Google that Frontline expose 2017. You can't find it?
It's not answering my question. My question is about Portland.
Okay, so Portland, so think about it. Do you think the equivalent of NEDCO in do you think the equivalent in NEDCO in Portland would just stop doing business? No. No.
She's saying more money will be available.
No, that's our public money, right? That money is available so that the city would build housing, and then the public sector would build housing. But she's conflating those numbers and saying the public sector would build.
Do we have? I don't know where the batteries went. I brought some last week.
A lot of public housing, it has to be built on leverage dollars. No one source, even tax credits, will be the only source of funding into a project. So leverage of different funding sources becomes very important to attract the other money that you need. And that's where having a local bond that can be paired with other money and having access for private nonprofit developers to have access to local bond dollars when we're going to apply for other funding, we use it as leverage. We say, look, our local bond dollars are paying for 40% of this project if you'll give us the other 60%. If we don't have that 40, we can't attract the other 60. So that's where it helps us leverage other dollars that we wouldn't get if we didn't have the money committed. Eugene has a little bit of like home and CDBG money now that they can award to us that helps us leverage a certain amount of money, but if we had bond dollars, it helps us leverage a whole lot more money. So it lets us bring net more federal dollars, net more state dollars into local projects than we would otherwise be able to. That's where it comes from. I also just want to sneak in, the cost of affordable housing and how expensive it is to develop is a very hot topic right now. Oh, wait, before I get to that, I also did want to say the Googles of the world, the big banks of the world, they're getting into tax credit buying. They're not getting into affordable housing development and ownership. Google's not developing housing in Oregon. Google might be buying tax credits, and that's a conversation for a different day and one I will help you defeat if you want to take it on. Affordable housing is expensive to develop because we have to develop it to last for 60 years or 90 years. We can't count on rents to do repairs over time, and so we have to build very high quality housing on the front end so that it's durable and it's energy efficient to operate. So it is relatively more expensive, and we are building fewer units now than we were 20 years ago because those costs have gone up. And that's a reality, that would not get better and I think would actually get worse if municipalities are building the housing. because nothing is easy to get through city government or county government. It just ups the complexity and it ups some of the costs. So I think we need to set aside the cost factor now and just realize that affordable housing is going to be expensive, and we need more dollars into the system to do it.
Deep breath, everybody. There's a lot of passion here, and obviously all of us want people to have houses, and we're going to get the job done. Personally, I have no problem voting no just because there's nothing else on the table right now. That's what makes us put something else on the table. I love NEDCO. My question is sort of like answer this statement. Emily, you said something in referring to changing the Constitution, that it was, only for this one situation, and don't worry, it's not going to open the door up. I have a real problem with that because I'm old enough that when I got my Social Security number and was told it was going to be private forever, I really believed that. And I am not that naive as I was 50 years ago. So when you want to change the Constitution, don't tell me it's just going to be for this one situation and it won't change in the future.
Well, I think that's wise, but even if it were just for the affordable housing sector, it's, there's this emphasis on, it's such a tiny, tiny change, but it's and so narrowly defined, but actually it's so vaguely defined, right? That's one issue. And the other issue is the affordable housing industry is not only is it an $8 billion a year industry, but it's also one of our most basic human rights. It's a survival need. And if we are going to let private interest invade further into that and let go, right? Emily said no one wants to take on 100% of the funding to be the single funding source. You know what? Single payer healthcare, you know what that would be? One funding source. That's what we're talking about. Let's allow at least there to be some of the affordable housing stock to be publicly owned, and let's not give that away, Oregon. Thank you.
So I think that it's right that there should be this level of careful consideration that goes into any constitutional amendment. Absolutely. It doesn't, I wasn't saying that this is a small change to try to say it shouldn't be carefully considered. I was saying this is a small change just to define the parameters of it. And if there was a future change, it should get equal inquiry and equal discussion and equal debate. And we may have that to face in the future. But I don't want to let the fear of that and what it might be, because it might be something good in the future, detract from making progress today and making this what is a relatively, I think, well-defined, limited change that can produce real units of housing on the ground, because it is a human right. It is a huge problem. I mean, I walk the streets of Eugene every day. I see the waiting list that NEDCO manage. I see the waiting list that others manage. We don't need something a year from now. We don't need something 2 years from now. We need it now, and we need all the tools.
Okay, we have 2 minutes, so, less than a minute for your question each. That'd be awesome.
Hi, my name's Krista, and I'm really concerned about affordable housing. I have a large home I have a home that is filled with people who would otherwise be homeless right now. But I think, I've read the measure carefully, and I think it's so vaguely written, and I really fear unintended consequences. We thought we were going to be doing good things with MUPD, and it was huge burdens on the homeowners in Eugene, picking up the property taxes that the rich are not paying for so that we can guarantee them 15% profit. And so I am just concerned about all of the unintended consequences, and I wish you could address those, because I don't think that this is the answer.
I just want to clarify that MUPD wasn't meant for affordable housing, so that's a different issue that we can debate another day. I just want to reiterate how much of a structured system this is, and that a new bond is not going to change how housing is developed. It's not going to change who gets rich from it. It's not going to change who wants to do it. The housing that gets built is going to be built by the same nonprofit developers that are building it now. I really don't share the fear of unintended consequences, and I work in this business every day. I beat my head against pro formas every day, and if anybody really wants to research in depth how the financials get put together for one of these projects, I will sit down and run through it with you. Your eyes will be crossed by the end of it, but I'm happy to, because I think that's what it takes to really understand what we're talking about here, and the lack of risk of unintended consequences.
I would say if it's so heavily monitored, heavily regulated, why isn't any level of bottom line metrics included in the amendment? And the other thing I would say, if we were going to talk about being able to open up all our tools in the affordable housing, in our efforts to create affordable housing, one of those tools is to have publicly owned housing stock, period. Don't take that tool away from us.
Just very quickly, that tool has existed since bonds existed, and literally no cities or counties have done it because they're not willing.
In 2016, Portland did it, and now look who's coming in for that money. Corporate interests. Thank you.
So I just want to announce that next Saturday here, 11 to 1, we're going to be taking an endorsement vote. So we're going to either vote as a group, yes on 102 or no on 102. So by the ORLC bylaws, we have to give the membership a week's notice. So this is your week's notice according to our bylaws. Thanks. One last question.
Hi, my name is Chris. Thank you both for coming and speaking on this important. Thank you for both speaking on this very important issue. I currently work on trying to deal with the unhoused right now. I currently work on affordable options now. We do have things like LRPDs that are supposed to be able to help our low income. We have, as communities, tried to levy taxes, levy processes. Is there any chance that this, should it not pass, that you both would be willing to consider investing in local builds, training some of our unskilled, our displaced workers to build homes so that those costs are no longer affiliated to outside firms, to outside developers, because we can build for ourselves? Where are our supports and our ballots for those? Thank you.
A lot of us as affordable housing developers do support job training. Most of us hire local people. I mean, the people who build NEDCO housing are local firms, they're local contractors, they're local subs, they're local tradespeople. So that exists. I think it's great. I am on a soapbox every chance I get trying to encourage our schools to have more CTE programs in the building trades because we absolutely need more people. So I think that's, whether this passes or not, I think those are great ideas.
Yes, absolutely. And I just want to say, after this, I'll sit somewhere near the door, and anyone who wants to just come put their name on a list for organizing to get something on the next ballot, I would love to do that. We already have some of that in the works, but we need as many people as we can get. Thank you so much.
Thank you, both of you, for coming today. Awesome. And thanks for everybody's participation.